When we were children, Jim and Marshall and I had a favorite story that we actually put a title to so we could tell Granddad very easily what story we wanted to hear. And we called the story The Mysterious Stranger. Granddad said about, less than a year after his father was killed, in the summertime, probably late summer, he and Uncle Henry were out in the garden, working in the garden, waiting for Mother Peebles to have dinner ready to go on the table and to call them in and say it was time to eat, because they ate dinner before they went and did their chores. And they looked down the canyon and a rider was coming up the canyon, so they stopped what they were doing, and the rider came up and he said, "Are you Elijah's boys?" And they said yes. And the stranger said, "Is your mother around?" And they said, "Yes, sir, she's in the house cooking dinner." And he says, "Oh, that's great, I'm hungry. You guys come here a minute." And he handed the reins of the horse off to Uncle Henry and said, "Take that horse over to the water trough and water him and tie him up, and then get back over here real fast." And while Uncle Henry was watering the horse, he asked Granddad about, what they've been doing today, and Granddad told him, well, they did chores, and then most of the day they've been working in the garden. And when Uncle Henry came back, he reached into his shirt pocket and he pulled out 2 shiny new silver dollars. And he said, "You see these? If you will do something for me and do it faithfully, when I leave, these silver dollars belong to you." And of course, Granddad and Uncle Henry, never having seen that much money, said, "Of course, yes, whatever you want us to do." And so the stranger told Uncle Henry, "You go over there on the other side of that woodpile, pull yourself up a seat, and I want you to watch toward the northeast where that road goes, and I want you to watch down the canyon toward the road that goes to Fort Stanton. And if you see anybody on that road, you run into the house and tell me." And Uncle Henry took off to the other side of the woodpile, and he looked at Granddad and he said, "I want you to go to the other end of the orchard, and I want you to look to the north toward the mountain and toward Monjo, and if you see anybody coming down the canyon, I want you to run into the house as fast as you can and tell me someone's coming." So Granddad went to the other side of the orchard, and the stranger went into the house. He was in the house for quite some time, and then he came out and he whistled, told the boys to come here. He gave them the silver dollars, and he said, "Y'all better go in and eat your dinner. It's ready now." And he got on his horse, and Granddad and Uncle Henry, being hungry young boys, went straight into the house. They never did see which direction he left from. Mother Peebles was standing at the stove, and she told them, "Clear the dirty dishes off the table, and put clean dishes out so you guys can eat your dinner." And when they picked up the plate that was on the table, underneath it was a $20 gold piece. And that's where Granddad would end the story. And we would ask him, Granddad, was that Billy the Kid?" And he would tell us, "If you look at your history books, it says plain and clear in the history books that Billy the Kid was dead before I was born." But I will say here that Granddad did tell us many a time when he was settling an argument, or when there was a discussion among the older men about a point of view on a story, that in every history book, every argument, almost everything in life, there's always at least 2 points of view, and many times there are many more than that. So my brothers and I always kind of wondered who this mysterious stranger was that came in and gave so much money to a new widow and her sons, and just disappeared. We did ask Granddad if he ever saw that stranger again, and he said, well, if I did, he wasn't using the same name. And that's as much as he would say. So that was our favorite story when we were growing up. We used to play at the stranger visiting when we had time to play or to imagine. It captured our imaginations. Now, the next story I want to tell isn't one that Granddad told me, but one that Herbert Lee Traylor told me. Now, Herbert Lee Traylor, when I was in elementary school, was my elementary school principal. And he was my mother's first and second grade teacher and my father's seventh and eighth grade teacher. But when my grandfather was in school, one of the old boys in the old form, meaning sixth grade, Herbert Lee was one of the little bitty boys in the first form, meaning kindergarten, first grade level. And it was after my grandfather died. Actually, it was while I was in college. And Herbert Lee and I were talking about old stories, and he was writing his books because he'd retired. Herbert Lee told me these two little stories on my grandfather. He said, my grandfather and my Uncle Henry were smart Alecs and had a great sense of humor. And when Granddad and Uncle Henry were in the sixth grade, they went the last year of school together because they were old enough to get up and do the chores, go to school, come home, do chores, and get everything accomplished as big boys. And so they were in the sixth form together, their last year in school. And the assignment that the teacher gave was to write a poem. And some kids wrote kind of something that was like a poem, and some kids wrote really good poems. And the poem that Granddad wrote went kind of like this. There once was an old crow flying over our school. He looked down to see what he thought was a jewel. But to his regret, it was nothing more than a fool, come from Texas to teach our school. Well, needless to say, the teacher was upset, must have not had a sense of humor, because Granddad got a whipping for that one. And later on, this particular teacher was doing something that Granddad and Uncle Henry thought was disgraceful, and that absolutely scandalized the girls, the older girls, in the older form, in the highest form, who were fifth, sixth grade. And I don't suppose many of the parents would have been too happy about it either. But this particular teacher liked to use a switch or a cane as a form of discipline for anything that happened, which in those days wasn't that unusual a thing to happen. And the boys pretty much knew if they were going to get switched or caned, they had one layer of pants on, and hopefully it was pretty thick. But all of the girls, especially the ones in the upper forms, had on 2 or 3 petticoats. Well, they had on bloomers, and then they had on 2 or 3 petticoats, and then they had on a skirt or a dress over the top of that. And the fabrics weren't as thin and clingy as they are now. So when the girls got switched or caned, it wasn't near as painful. So this particular teacher decided that he was going to turn the girls over his knee and lift their skirts and their petticoats to cane them. And as I said, the girls were scandalized. The boys were pretty upset as well. And Granddad and Uncle Henry decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. And so when the teacher went out to use the outhouse, they locked the schoolhouse door and wouldn't let him back in. And they said that he was no teacher that they wanted in their school, and he could go back to Texas, and that was that. Well, the teacher got mad enough that he rode over to Benita, rode up to Benita, found one of the members of the school board, and had the school board come down and talk to the boys. So Uncle Henry and Granddad let the school board member in and a couple of other parents that he brought with him, and they told him, they said, we'll teach the school for the rest of the year. He doesn't need to be in here because he's doing indecent things to the girls. He's lifting their skirts and he's caning them. Well, Granddad and Uncle Henry got expelled. The teacher got fired, and they had someone's mother, one of the ladies in the neighborhood, taught out the rest of the school year. But Granddad and Uncle Henry got expelled. They did graduate. I guess it was close enough to the end of the school year that they went ahead and let them graduate from the 6th grade with the rest of the class. Or maybe they just did their work from home. I'm not sure what happened. Herbert Lee wasn't really sure either what happened. But that's the kind of boys Granddad and Uncle Henry were. By the time they were that age and in the final form in school, they were actually doing the work of full-grown men. They were taking care of the cattle. They were taking care of the sheep. They were helping with the garden. They were building fence. They were doing anything that a full-grown man could do. So I think they were probably pretty relieved that they got expelled. I don't know if the school went all the way to 7th or 8th grade or not. I know that in this area at that time, that was about the time I would say that New Mexico became a state. Up until 1913, New Mexico was a territory. It wasn't even a state in the United States. So I imagine you would have had to go to Lincoln. I don't know if Lincoln had a high school. I'm not even sure where the closest high school would have been. Carrizozo didn't exist in those days. Or it did, but it was a very small, it was a railroad town. They had to have a place for the railroad to stop. So it was a railroad town. And just beginning to get started. Capitan was just beginning to get started because they were mining coal out of the hills around Capitan, and had a spur that would carry the coal down to Carrizozo, because of course they were steam engines in those days. So I'm not even sure where the closest high school would have been. But from that day on, they were considered grown men, ranch owners and ranch managers. Well, because I guess they entered manhood so very young, Uncle Henry and Granddad both married young as well. Uncle Henry was about 19 when he met Aunt Lida. She was a local girl who didn't live too far away, and they courted for a year, and then they got married. And then some neighbors, Barney and Becky Van Pelt, had a young woman, beautiful young woman, come and visit them from Roswell. She came up by buggy with her parents and planned to stay about a month or so, and then the Van Pelts were going to take her home. Well, before she went home, somewhere in the neighborhood, and I don't know if Barney and Becky had a barn dance, or if it was the Bloods or the Lucks, or I'm not sure, but somebody had a barn dance. And Granddad met this beautiful young woman by the name of Gladys McAnally. And he was smitten. So when she went home, he went to visit her a few times, borrowed Mother Peebles' buggy. And he and Henry and Aunt Lida would get in the buggy and go down to Roswell. Well, Roswell is about 90 miles away from here. And horses can't go that far in one day, so they'd go down to Riverside. They'd go down the Little Creek Valley to Glencoe, and then on down the Hondo Valley to Riverside, and stop and spend the night, camp out. Then they would go back across the mesa and on into Roswell. Well, that was pretty tough way to court, because Granddad and Uncle Henry, or even Granddad by himself, had a pretty hard time finding 2 days down, a day to visit, and 2 days back. And if you were going to spend more than just 1 day visiting in Corton, it took a whole week just to go see your girl. So Granddad and Uncle Henry decided to pool their all of their funds and to buy a car. And once every 2 months, Granddad and Uncle Henry would get in this car and they would drive to Roswell over a bumpy dirt road. Sometimes happen to get out and push it through the mud, because weren't a lot of on Little Creek for sure there weren't any bridges, and I'm not sure down the Hondo Valley how many bridges they had either. So you had to drive across the creeks and the rivers, and in the wintertime there was snow. But Granddad courted this beautiful young woman, and finally, just after his 19th birthday, and before her 18th birthday, they got married, and he brought her home. At this time, Uncle Henry and Aunt Lyda were living in the old Breese homestead cabin, and they had a baby Laura, and Charlie and his wife, my granddad and his wife, moved in with his mother. Now, I will refer almost always to my grandmother, Gladys, as Honey, because I have the letters that they wrote back and forth to each other when they were courting. And he almost always, after the third or fourth letter, referred to her as Dear Honey. And I very seldom ever heard my grandfather call my grandmother anything but Honey. So when I was born, they tried to get me to call her grandmother or granny or any one of the other names that a grandchild calls grandma. But no, I would only call her Honey, because I guess that's what Granddad called her. And of course my brothers picked that habit up from me. And till the day she died, she was known around Alto and Ruidoso and Capitan, even Carrizozo, as Honey Peebles. So that's the story. And I've told you a lot of what happened between the time Granddad's and Uncle Henry's father was killed and when they became adults. And I am sure that I will tell more Granddad stories as time passes. It's kind of difficult to remember all the stories you want to tell when you're telling one after another. And you think as you get to the end of a recording session, oh, I should have told that one. Or right after you turn the recorder off, you say, oh, I should have told that story. Or, oh, I should have told that story. So as I remember these stories and as they pop into my mind, I will try to write them down and stick them in here and stick them in there, or maybe I will do a time when I just do catch-up stories. Catch-up stories. I wonder if catch-up stories are read. Oh, well. Spoken a little bit about how my grandfather felt about charity, but I want to give you a couple of examples of how he thought about responsibility. There were 2 older ladies. I'm not sure exactly how old they were. They were both older than my grandfather, who were underneath his sense of responsibility. One of them was Aunt Emma. Aunt Emma was the little girl that my great-grandparents adopted before Uncle Henry and Granddad were born. She married a man who was a postmaster in El Paso. But El Paso in those days without air conditioning was very, very, very hot for somebody who had been raised in the mountains. And so she would come up and spend time at their cabin and little ranchette that she owned. And by the time that I knew her, her husband was dead, and her son was taking care of the place. We called him Cousin Wilbur, and he worked in El Paso as well, so he would come up on the weekends and be with her. But during the week, and before he got there on like Saturday, one of my responsibilities while she was there was to go by horseback up the canyon to Aunt Emma's house and take milk and eggs and stuff from the garden, sometimes coffee and sugar in my saddlebags, and take those up to her. But just to take those up to her would have been charity. So I had to go out and pick the things out of the garden myself, and then explain to her that I was just showing her how well our garden was growing, and that Granddad had sent the sugar and coffee, so her son Wilbur would be sure to have it when he got there. But it wasn't just to take the food up and drop it off. Part of the responsibility in taking care of someone was to spend time with them. So I would sit and visit, and we would talk about how the garden was growing and how my calves were doing, and how the weather was, and maybe we would go for a little walk, and look at the wildflowers, or pick up pine cones, all kinds of little things, as long as she was there in the summer. The other lady that I took care of was Mrs. Arnold. And Mrs. Arnold was a longtime resident, and her husband was dead, died when my grandfather and Uncle Henry were just young men. And that's a story I'll tell you at another time. And her children, her sons, had grown up and moved away and left Mrs. Arnold there at their house. And Mrs. Arnold was our local wise woman, I guess you could say. If you wanted a natural remedy on how to cure something, or if you wanted to know something about the herbs in the garden and how to use them, and I don't mean just in cooking, I mean in getting rid of evil spirits, and warding off insects, or any number of things, preventing deer from eating your garden. Or if you wanted to know how to use the wildflowers and wild plants that also grew around. Mrs. Arnold and my grandmother both had a theory that within 50 miles of where you lived was you could find whatever it was that needed to cure just about any illness. I remember one time I arrived at her house. With Mrs. Arnold, I took the mail and coffee or and sugar, and sometimes special spices that she didn't have that she might have requested, and sometimes stuff out of the garden. She had a garden as well, so she didn't need very much, but sometimes she didn't have the variety of things in her garden that we had. So we would sometimes take some stuff out of our garden and say, see how big it got, and all of that kind of stuff. And so walking in the garden and talking about herbs, that kind of thing, was how I spent my time with Mrs. Arnold. And she tried so hard, bless her heart, to teach me how to play the piano, but I am just not musically inclined. So about as far as she ever got and teach me to play the piano was lightning and thunder. And if you don't know what lightning and thunder is, well, it's not very musical, let me tell you. But one time I arrived at Mrs. Arnold's house, and she had a silk stocking tied around her head. And I asked her, why the silk stocking? And she says, well, I have dried lavender in it. And I had a little headache this morning. And dried lavender in silk, if you tie it around your head, will get rid of a headache. I managed to keep my mouth shut. I
didn't believe in a lot of the things that she told me. However, I have since discovered that a piece of silk with lavender in it tied around your head does wonders for getting rid of a headache. I don't know if it's the lavender, don't think it's the silk, but it does get rid of some headaches. Not all headaches. But going and taking care of these ladies. Now, when I say I went and took care of them, it was mainly just checking on them and visiting with them, making sure that they had company, someone, something to look forward to every week. I rode my horse, both to Aunt Emma's and to Mrs. Arnold's, and tied the horse on the hitching post. Both of them had a hitching post in front of their houses. Tied the horse to the hitching post and took stuff out of the saddlebags and took in whatever I was taking in, and spent time with them. And this was my responsibility. And Aunt Emma died, I suppose, when I was about 9 or 10 years old. And Mrs. Arnold lived much, much longer than that, but I think she died when I was about 17 or 18. But because these ladies were widowed and older, and neither of them had a vehicle, I don't think either one of them knew how to drive. They could have driven a buggy or a wagon or something like that, no problem. But neither one of them ever learned to drive. And so they were kind of isolated and stuck in their houses, or in places, in a place where they could walk or something like that. They could go, but they couldn't go very far. So they depended upon family and neighbors to help provide the stuff that they needed and what they needed. And Granddad just decided that since they were our neighbors, it was our responsibility to look after them. Now, during the time that I was in school, in the wintertime, maybe starting around November when it was snow or rain or wet or something like that, my grandparents would start taking care of Mrs. Arnold and go up and visit her. But as soon as it warmed up in the spring, say beginning of April, and it was comfortable for me to go and ride my horse up the canyon, then it was my job again. So that was one of my granddad's ideas of responsibility. The other of his ideas of responsibility was being able to go and do what you were told and accomplish something. So I suppose I was maybe 7 years old, and Granddad took me with him up past Mrs. Arnold's house and on up Little Creek Canyon, all the way up the creek to the headwaters, which is just below Monjo Lookout Tower. And as we went up the creek, he showed me where all the spring boxes were that the cattle watered from, and that fed the creek and kept it running all summer. And twice or three times every summer, I would finish my chores, and Granddad would, yell for Jim and Marshall and I, and he'd already be at the saddle bend saddling up our horses, and have a couple, 2 or 3 bags of lunch to put in the saddlebags, and he would load the saddlebags up with our lunch and bottled water. Not the kind of bottled water you get now. These were kind of like canteens. They were bottles that were wrapped in canvas, and the canvas had been wet to keep them to keep the water cool. And he would send us, my brothers and I was the one who was responsible, all the way up to the headwaters of Little Creek to clean out all of the spring boxes. Today, people could not put children that age. You probably wouldn't even let 12 or 13-year-olds go by themselves riding up the creek like that, cleaning out spring boxes. But even at 7, 8 years old, we were taking the responsibility to do that. Now, I know that is because Granddad and Uncle Henry, when they were that age, were given that kind of responsibility. And so he didn't see anything strange in giving us that kind of responsibility. The great thing was he also gave us a lot of freedom. So when we finished cleaning out the spring boxes on Little Creek, we crossed over the ridge down into Eagle Creek. And down in Eagle Creek, they had a lot of campgrounds. And in the summertime, it was full of tourists. Most of them from Texas, but some of them from in places in New Mexico where they just needed to get away from the heat, the summer heat. And here we are, three little kids on three big horses riding through the campgrounds. And people would flag us down and want to know if they could take our pictures. And they'd want to know if they could take a picture of their child on our horse, or if we would take their child for a little ride on our horse. And yeah, for a nickel, we'd do that. And for a nickel, we'd do that. For a nickel, we'd do that. We finished one campground, we'd go to the next campground, do the same thing. Yeah, for a nickel, I'll give your child a ride. Yeah, for a nickel, you can take my picture. Yeah, we made enough money that by the time we got down, all the way down Eagle Creek to where the post office was, and I did tell you that the switchboard and the post office were in the same building. Lindy also kept a nice selection of candy and a few canned goods. It was just a little bitty tiny general store. And by the time we got down to Lindy's and the post office, we would have enough money between the three of us that we could get a soda and a candy bar to eat there, and a candy bar to eat on the way home, and a candy bar to put away. Of course, now you have to remember that a soda costs 10 cents, and a candy bar, a Hershey bar, cost a nickel, and you could get 2 Tootsie Rolls for a penny. So it wasn't really that much money, but we had money to jingle in our pockets, that's for sure. When Lindy and Eileen saw us coming, Eileen would go over to the switchboard and ring up my grandparents and say, okay, the kids are fine. See them coming down the road. Pockets must be jingling with money. We'll let you know when they leave here. So, and then we would ride along the side of the highway back to the house. The whole trip up and up to Monjo, up the canyon, back across down Eagle Creek, and then home was probably 6 or 7 miles. But I can't see putting a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 4-year-old on horseback and sending them by themselves for 7 miles today. We didn't think anything about it. No one in the neighborhood thought anything about it. They knew that we were going to do as we were told and take a little bit of extra freedom in selling our services and make a little money and get a little treat, and then that we would be home before dark. And that's what we did. So that's a little bit. I did say that there in an earlier time I was talking that I had a lot more freedom than kids than you could give to kids today. That's an example of some of the freedom I had. But that freedom went with responsibility as far as my grandfather was concerned. So that's a little bit of that and a little bit of this, and I think it's probably the end of this episode. I'll talk to you again soon.